We're here.
Let's get this party started. How you doing? Thanks for being here. My name is Dennis Neal. I'm a partner with Citric & Company and a longtime journalist. And our panel today is the future of jobs, or the lack of it. And the big question is any job truly safe? And the answer is no. So thank you for being here, and we're done. A personal topic for me, because 2 years ago I left the Fox Business Network, and then suddenly it was like waking up from a Rip Van Winkle nap. And media had almost no jobs available, no growth, no willingness to take risk. What do you do? My gosh. And then I do more research and I realize, you know what? What happened to me in media, because they were one of the first industries to get hit, is coming to you guys next. It's coming to every sector, everywhere maybe. And this is something we're all going to have to deal with. So let's go ahead and talk about our panelists. We've got Kate Mitchell. She's the co-founder of Scale Venture Partners, venture capital. So we're going to hear whether private enterprise, what it might be able to do to help us out of that problem. We've got Michael Chu, partner with McKinsey Global Institute.
No.
Oh, Michael?
Alan looks better than I do. You keep pointing
okay.
over there and calling him Michael. It'll be fine.
Okay. Alan Kruger is a professor with Princeton and former chairman of the White House Council of Economic Advisors, and we're hoping he's going to explain exactly what went wrong with the economic recovery. Martin Ford is an author and entrepreneur. He did Rise of the Robots, really well-received book, and so he knows a lot about just how much of a threat tech is to us. And Michael Chu is the partner with McKinsey, sorry about that, Michael, Global Institute, who basically makes his living as a really, really smart guy. So let's start off basically with a really simple question among our panelists. Are you super pessimistic about the future of jobs, or are you somewhat optimistic or super optimistic? And let's start with Martin, who is kind of our most pessimistic person on the panel today.
Well, that's true. I am pessimistic specifically about the future of jobs, especially over the long run. That's not the same as being pessimistic overall about the future of society or the economy. I do think that we're going to need to make an adaptation there. But I think the answer to the question here about is any job truly safe, that very certainly almost clearly is no, I think, in the long run. But that's not the most important question that we're going to face in the near term. The issue that we face going forward is that a huge number of jobs, and I'm talking especially about jobs that are on some level routine and predictable, those jobs across the board, across industries, across occupations, and across skill levels are really going to be susceptible to automation going forward. And the technology that's really the driving force behind this that's going to make that happen is more than anything machine learning. It's this idea that an algorithm can churn through lots of data, and it might be historical data, it might be real-time data from some industrial process, but an algorithm can look at that data and figure out how to do things. It can learn. And this is something that is really quite disruptive. I mean, it's about machines ultimately encroaching on the fundamental capability that sets human beings apart. And this is what's different, and it's going to be a huge deal going forward.
Okay, boiled down, we're doomed. Now, Kate Mitchell, do you think we're doomed?
I don't think we're doomed. I think, is any job truly safe? I would amend that and say, is any existing job truly safe? I think the answer is we all have to be concerned. I mean, the most frequent, most popular job in the country today is truck driver. If you look at Planet Money has a map. If you look it up, it's sort of like, wow, with autonomous vehicles, which is the section here, that's going to be a big change. But we're going to need to have drone operators. We're going to need to have data scientists. And we'll talk more as the panel goes on. 600,000 jobs, the National Association of Manufacturers are saying, are going wanting for lack of people that are skilled, can handle skilled manufacturing jobs. So I think there's dislocation, but with that, I think there's real opportunity. We'll talk more about that.
Good. Michael, doomed or optimistic?
So I agree with Martin. No job is truly safe, but I'm going to do a TV thing, which you're familiar with, and reject the question, because I actually think that the wrong way to think about it is at the aggregation of jobs. So when we looked at over 900 different occupations, we looked at the individual activities that make up jobs, 2,000 of them. And we actually think that it's more likely that individual activities will be automated than entire jobs. Less than 5% of full occupations can be automated by adapting currently developed technology. But 45% of activities we pay people to do can be automated by adapting currently developed technologies. So I think we need to look at a level below jobs in order to understand what the real effect is.
Okay, I want to return to that. It's interesting. Alan, take it.
Well, I think of the two problems to have, which is technology replacing workers, replacing a lot of the tasks they do, and stagnation and no productivity growth, I'd rather have the former problem, first of all, because that means that in potential we could grow more and work less, and then our problems become one of distribution and work sharing. I think the nature of work is changing rather dramatically. And even without some of the technological changes, although I think that's driving a lot of it, we're seeing big changes. And I had a couple of slides. I don't know, Martin, Dennis, if you think it's okay
Next
to show
section?
them.
I got you next.
Oh, okay, that's fine. So I think if you go throughout history, there's always been fear that technology is going to replace jobs. I did a similar calculation to the one Michael mentioned on what fraction of jobs could be offshored. Alan Blinder and I have a few studies where we come up with about 25% of the work people are doing in the US could be done by somebody in another country where normally they would be paid less. So if you add that up with your 45%, you got a pretty big number. But there are
Although it's probably the same, right? I mean,
there's obviously
offshoring
some
is one
overlap.
step on the way to automating.
There's obviously
Yeah.
some overlap. And I think what we're going to do is see changes in the nature of work. And I think we might think more about work than about jobs. And when the economy works the way it's supposed to, and we have the kinds of progress that scares Martin, we have reductions in work hours, so we have more work sharing, and that was a major change in the last century. And we also have new products, new services. So even though manufacturing has become so much more productive, we've moved into other sectors. So I think what we need to give a lot of thought to is how can we make the economy function this way? How can we reduce barriers to having new industries, new products form? Because it's very hard to predict where workers will be working in the future. Last thing I'll say. I did a project a while ago to try to go back and say how much of the job growth from the mid-1960s to the 2005, over that 40-year period, was due to sectors, occupations that we were not even tracking back in 1965, that the Bureau of Labor Statistics didn't even have a code for. And the vast majority of the job growth was in jobs that hadn't been invented yet. And if you go back to, plastics, it's been a below average occupation since the graduate. So I think it's very difficult to predict, and what we could try to do is set the conditions to make it easier for new sectors to arise.
Well,
I like that.
I'll do one quick thing, finishing on my Planet Money map. If you look at 4 states, you have truck driver in most states. If you look at 4 states, Colorado, Utah, Virginia, and Washington, the most popular job in those states, computer scientists. So, exactly.
All right, now why don't we assess the current picture, the lackluster recovery. It's been one of the worst recoveries from a downturn in modern history. And how much of this do we think is because of government policies or lack of confidence versus how much is because of these very tech shifts we're talking about to where it's already beginning to show up? Michael, why don't you start us off, and then Alan, you come next with your charts.
I don't know, to be honest. Right,
Not allowed to say that.
Yeah, quick. Is it cyclical or structural? It's probably both. Some of what's happening, is an extended recovery, which takes a long time, particularly for financially driven recessions. They always take longer to recover from. But as Alan mentioned, as we've all mentioned, the economy really is changing. The way that jobs and occupations and the employer-employee relationship is changing over time. So I think part of it's structural and part of it's cyclical.
Okay, Alan has a chart, and I usually am against charts during panel discussions because you want to hear these people talk, but he has a chart that stunned me, and it was about job growth since the bottom of the economy, right? And how many jobs? You want to do that? To take it over.
I'll do that, but it's actually from before the bottom. So to answer your question, I think the reason why this has been a moderate recovery is because households were so harmed by the Great Recession. They lost so much wealth, housing value collapsed so much, we overbuilt so many homes. And if you look at what's been particularly weak in this recovery, it's been consumer spending on discretionary items, which I don't think is being driven by policy or even technological changes. I think it is, as Michael said, kind of a natural slow process after a crisis. And the good thing we have going for us is this may well be the longest recovery on record, if not the strongest. So I think it's very important that we not have self-inflicted wounds.
This is the weakest. It's not the strong. I mean, there's no chance that it can be the strong. I mean, it's
Well,
the weakest
wait 1 second. Go
ever.
back to 1980. There was a recovery that lasted 2 years and turned into a recession. So we could well have had, we could well have had, cut off the recovery much sooner. But over the last decade, there's been a remarkable development in the labor market, and I have a few slides just to document this. And this is from some brand new research I've been doing. where we're looking at the changes in the nature of work. And the first chart shows the percentage of workers in alternative work arrangements. So yellow bars, which are a little bit hard to read, show that the share of workers who are freelancing. The green bars next to it show the share of workers who are contracted out to work for another company. And then you see workers who are in temporary help jobs or on call. And in the previous decade, there was hardly any growth in these categories. Freelancing edged up, contracting out was pretty flat. We've seen a 5-fold increase in the share of workers who are contracted out to work for other companies. And that's grown from security guards and cafeteria workers, janitors, up the occupational distribution. And I think some of what's driving that is the jobs are more commoditized. It's easier if you're doing payroll to have ADP do it. It's not specific to a particular company. Same thing with legal services. And this next chart shows you really remarkable.
Can I just interrupt a bit? Because I
Sure.
think you left out the most important fact. I was stunned to see that of all of the 7-point-something million jobs we've gained back
That was
since
the next chart.
Okay.
So
there it is.
just hold,
Go for
hold
it.
that for a moment. Of the 9.1 million net jobs that we've had created over the last decade, 9.4 million, more than 100%, has been growth in the alternative employment sector. Which means that basically we've been flat in terms of traditional employment relationships. The biggest growth is in jobs that were contracted out, and the second biggest is in freelancing. So this goes to what you said earlier, that the media has changed dramatically. That's a big area where freelancing has gone way up, contracting out has gone way up. And this is only partly driven by the Uberization of the workforce. If you add Uber, TaskRabbit, all of the online platform economy together, that makes up about 0.5% of the workforce. Now, having said that, Uber is still a remarkable phenomenon. And it suggests to me that going forward, we're going to see much more growth in this emerging sector in addition to continuing growth in freelancing and contracting out. So this last chart shows you the number of Uber drivers in the US. And Uber X drivers are the kind of mustard color line, and Uber Black is the black line, cleverly chosen. And you can see Uber Black has grown linearly, and Uber X has grown exponentially. The number of Uber X drivers has doubled, more than doubled, every 6 months for the last 4 years.
What is Uber Black? I'm sorry.
Uber Black is the
Full-timers?
no. Uber Black is a higher quality car and a
expensive.
commercial. It's more expensive,
yeah.
and it's a commercially licensed driver. Uber X is what anyone with a driver's license can do. And if this pace continues, everyone in this room will be an Uber X driver before very long. So it's going to have to level off. But Uber is really an exception in the platform economy because it's about half of the entire platform economy.
Okay. Martin, should we be concerned that all these jobs, the job growth we've had is so much freelance stuff and so much kind of not building a permanent relationship? You know, in my entire 30-year career, I'd worked for only 4 companies. It feels like anyone getting out of college now can't have that expectation.
Right. I mean, it's definitely a major social transformation. These jobs have issues associated with them, that they're not stable. They don't provide reliable income. They don't provide, in many cases, fringe benefits and so forth. So that's a real issue socially. Beyond that, I'm concerned that, Michael had made the point earlier that offshoring is often the first step toward automation. I wonder if a lot of what we see here is not subject to the same basic idea, that this is what we see first. A lot of this is based on the advance of technology. Technology is what enables all of this freelance work and gig economy and all of that. That may just be the first step on a path that ultimately heads toward full automation. And of course, the most obvious example of that would be the fact that Uber is investing heavily in building self-driving cars. So they don't expect those drivers to be around there forever. They want to get rid of them.
Yeah, even
and
that.
I think that you will find the same basic truth exists for the rest of the gig economy.
Okay.
The other important point is that all of this, although it's growing very fast, represents still a very small part of the economy. Most people still work in traditional jobs, and those traditional jobs are, I think, ripe for disruption in many cases.
But because that's the installed base, so what your data shows, that it's the
85%.
cutting edge, right?
Yes.
Kate, isn't it the mission and goal of technology actually to eliminate jobs, to let us do far more with far
Absolutely
less?
not.
Isn't that what tech is
No,
aimed at?
no.
Why did we have an incredible productivity revolution, a huge upsurge for 10 or 20 years after PCs came in? I mean, tech is supposed to let us do more with fewer people.
Actually, tech has two sides to it. And first of all, nobody sits down and innovates with the idea of eliminating somebody's job. What people do is focus on productivity, which is a positive, I mean, as you've referred to, Al. What tech can do, and I'll give you a couple good examples that increase jobs, particularly in the discussions we've talked about. Uber drivers, your research itself, Alan points out, 8% of them were unemployed when they became drivers. They're doing it to supplement income. In addition, it provides a huge amount of flexibility in their days. I've spoken to drivers who had children at home that when they were on a fixed taxi schedule, they couldn't take care of, and they now can. Even more, you think about things like crowdsourcing. My sister and brother-in-law are graphic designers in northern Michigan. Not a hotbed for lots of graphic design work right now. They can not have to move. They can be part of a crowdsourcing. 99 Designs is a crowdsourced technology that allows graphic designers to supplement their income and to take jobs not only all across the country, across the world, and completely supplement the income that you have. She doesn't have to move. There's not a lot of dislocation. I think there's a huge amount of opportunity where tech actually can do a lot more. And then you think about the layers of online education with Coursera, Khan Academy, all these places where if I live in Detroit, which is where my in-laws are from, and I used to work at a car company, I can get a computer science degree from Stanford University to get a job, and those are the kinds of jobs that today are going hunting. So I think technology has two sides to it. It's easy to villainize it. I think there's a lot of opportunity at the same time.
Okay, Michael, despite that wonderful surge in productivity we've had for the past 10 or 20 years, lately it seems like it's suddenly stalled. Do you have any ideas into what's going on there?
Yeah, so that actually is a frustrating and very concerning thing, which is that productivity has not been growing as it has been historically. A couple of things. You know, number one, to Kate's point, it is. I don't think most technologies go to work thinking, let's go and kill some jobs. In fact, most of the productivity benefits we often see from automation or other technologies are not in reducing labor, but actually increasing the numerator of the productivity equation. So higher quality, fewer errors, higher throughput. You know, it's really producing more at higher quality, which is the majority of the benefits rather than reducing labor. But it does, in many cases, reduce labor. On the productivity question, it is, again, it's another a bit of a economic mystery. I think, you know, there are questions about whether or not we're measuring the right things, right? Many of us use search on our mobile devices, et cetera. How much do we pay for it? Not a whole lot. We get a lot of value of it, and GDP, you know, generally does not capture consumer surplus. So there's a lot of stuff that there are questions about measurement. But I think another one thing that we've noted, and Dennis, you made reference to it before, in previous generations of disruptive technologies, there was a gap between the time at which we developed the technology and deployed and invested in it, and the time we actually, you know, actually saw real productivity increases. You know, Bob Solo's famous, you know, Solo paradox. You know, we see the computer age everywhere except in the productivity statistics. He said that in the 80s. You know, I'm proud that, you know, the firm I worked with him a little bit, and by the 90s we saw that acceleration. Why? It takes, you know, complementary management innovation, complementary process changes, along with the technology in order to actually achieve, you know, productivity benefits. And so I think that's something that we might see now.
But wait a minute, if I may.
Yeah.
This slingshot, the fact that the tech came and then it was this delay and then finally you saw the
Yeah.
effects. Are you saying that is now shortened and you're seeing the effects far sooner?
I don't know that it's shortened. And so it's some of the research we're doing now, which is how long will it take to adapt as we adopt? Because I think it does, you know, oftentimes, you know, I'm a technologist. I like this techie stuff. I have a computer science PhD and all that. I like dealing with it. But the truth is, I think a lot of the hard stuff, the real hard work, in addition to technology development, is how do we change organizations? How do we change how people operate? How do we change business models? And it's unclear to me that in aggregate, in some cases we see extreme acceleration, but in aggregate, that's the real hard work that we have to do in the economy, and I don't know how much that's accelerating. I think that gives us some time to figure out how to adapt as we adopt, but in some cases that'll accelerate very quickly. So I think there's still, you know, it's not going to be tomorrow when 45% of the activities, as I cited, you know, earlier, will be automated.
Yeah, just a couple of comments on the productivity issue, which is really one of the paradoxes that we face, because obviously I'm talking about the rise of the robots, and here productivity is not very impressive. There are a couple of reasons you can think of that might be the case, at least for a time. One is that a lot of the advances we see, especially on the internet, are about disintermediation or cutting out the middleman and allowing people to use tools to do things for themselves. But the reality is that in many cases, the middleman that you're cutting out was an expert. And now you've got people doing sort of amateurishly things. An example would be booking your own travel. You might spend 20 hours planning a trip and doing all the details of that. But previously, if you had given that to a travel agent, the agent might have been able to do that in an hour or two. So it's unclear that that's a productivity increase that would be measured. To some extent, it's really a reversal of the process that has caused us to advance over time, which has been specialization and exchange. I mean, that's what Adam Smith talked about. To some extent, the tools that we have now have acted, at least initially, to reverse that. On the other hand, it's easy to imagine the point at which that changes is the point at which these tools become, in a sense, intelligent so that you can interact with them on the same basis that you might interact and exchange with another person. Once they reach that point, then you would see that reverse. So, I think that's something worth thinking about.
Okay. Alan, about jobs, I've covered tech since the early 80s and was of the firm belief all along that tech always ends up creating far more jobs than it destroys. Yet look at some figures since 2000. 1.1 million secretary jobs eliminated, travel agents down 46%, typists down 63%, bookkeepers down 26%, telephone operators down 64%. Do we yet have anywhere, because I searched and couldn't find it, a clear count of how many jobs we think new tech has eliminated and how many jobs it's created? Isn't it way out of balance right now versus previously?
I think it's not the raw number of jobs, but the nature of the work and the quality of the jobs. So what tech has done, along with globalization, but I think it's more technological changes, is to diminish the demand for workers with low level of skills. And we've automated a lot of that work. And at the same time, for workers with a more sophisticated level of skills and managerial skills, we've seen demand rise. And job growth has not been the problem, apart from the 8 million jobs that were lost in the Great Recession, which certainly was a problem. But if you look over the sweep of the 90s and the 2000s, job growth has been pretty solid. I mean, the flip side of the low productivity growth, which you rightly highlighted over the last 5 years, has been that we added almost 14 million jobs in that period. So I think what we need to do is to figure out how to raise the pay of the jobs, improve the benefits that the jobs come with, which is a real challenge given that more and more of the work is moving away from traditional employment, less connected to a traditional employer, and increased demand for workers with a more moderate level of skills, which is one of the things that Uber has actually done. It's kind of a unique thing in the information age where it increased demand for workers with relatively moderate level of skills.
Okay.
Now, I would say, by the way, to talk about that, you pointed out, and again, I want to go back to our title, is your job going to be disrupted? Existing jobs that are low-skilled jobs are challenged because they can't be done by robots and other things. There are jobs wanting for people that are skilled. 8 out of 10 jobs require digital literacy. I look at my friends at my age that are coming back into the workforce after having had children, and they haven't been operating. Just think of all the tools we use in our office every day, and they haven't operated with any of those recently. It makes it really difficult. So I think this issue of filling that gap, I think they're a completely different set of jobs for which it's difficult to find people that have 20, 30% job growth prospects going forward. And they aren't just in the deep technology areas like data science and computer systems analysts and things like that. It's even market research, dealing with a lot of the data that's coming out, a lot of what these folks here do on the stage that are still wanting. And I think the issue is there a quality of jobs? Are people prepared for them? And how consistent they are? And in terms of people being prepared, I think it's expanding digital literacy, which is really going to be critical for almost any kind of job, whether you're an artist, a scientist, a doctor,
The thing is, we keep talking about STEM, and we keep talking about needing to train these people to lift their skills, but the thing missing is, the number of jobs. Where are the jobs? The Oxford study says that 47% of jobs in the U.S. economy are eliminated in the next 20 to 25 years. Where's the jobs to use all these skills that we want to give these people to lift them up?
There are jobs for people that have skills, and that's the issue. If there's 600, if the Manufacturing Association is saying there's 600,000 skilled manufacturing jobs, we need to train people to use the like science. It used to be you would cut marble. We just got a new counter for our kitchen. It used to be done manually with somebody with a saw. It's now done by somebody, I went to and saw this, who has a very elaborate computer, and the people that program that, it's a very different skill set. Those jobs are not being filled. So to say that there are jobs that, there are too many people for the jobs, that's not true at this stage. And particularly for jobs with those kinds of high skills. And I think we should be thinking about skills like computer science and data analytics in the way we used to think about English. And so, I mean, it should be a language. It's replaced English as a language people need to know around the world.
Michael, can you find a way to disagree with her, please?
Not to disagree, but that means I'm going to disagree. No, I think it's natural for us to think about automation affecting low wage, low skill, low jobs. But I think that some of the work that Martin has documented is increasingly, and if you look at it at the activity level rather than at the job level, there are a significant amount of activities that high wage, high skill people do, which are increasingly automatable. I don't know if there are attorneys in the room, right? But if anyone has flashbacks back to corporate litigation back in the day, your law firm would hire, I don't know, a few hundred associates sometimes to read through all the documents from discovery and then identify the ones that are most relevant. Now e-discovery software does that all for you, right? And these are people who have an undergraduate degree, legal training, maybe some apprenticeship on top of that. That's high wage, high skill set of activities. And so, again, I think it's important not to just think, frontline, low wage, low skill are some of the activities that are susceptible to automation. Increasingly high wage, high skill activities are as well.
Radiologists, another perfect example, covered in the AI section.
Exactly.
Joe?
Right. I think there are a couple of reasons to be very skeptical that more education and training is going to, in the long run, be a solution to this. One is that the machines are very clearly climbing the skills ladder. And in many cases, an information manipulation job, if you're a knowledge worker, that's actually easier to automate than a low-skill manipulative job where you need lots of hand-eye coordination and dexterity and so forth. So those jobs are going to be heavily impacted. The other thing to think about is, if you believe that education is a solution and that's just something that's going to continue forever, then we're eventually going to get to the point where if you want a job, you've got to go to MIT and get a PhD in some technical field. And I think it's fairly obvious that not everyone in our population is going to be capable of making that kind of transition. So there is a point at which technology encroaches on fundamental human capability. And I think it is true that if you look throughout history, most people in our workforce have always been engaged in activities that are fundamentally routine and repetitive on some level. And that's something that I think is going to continue to be true. I mean, that's what people are capable of doing.
I'm really not nearly as pessimistic. I think if the artificial intelligence is that smart, it'll figure out new jobs for us to do.
That does sound
so
Or at least make us believe we're
You welcome our
Hold that
robotic
thought
overlords.
aside. If we reduce our work weeks, which is what I think we should do as we get richer, I think that'll be actually positive for our society. We've actually not had much of a decline in the work week over the last 40 years compared to the previous 40
We've
years.
had an increase because of connectivity and the gadget, right?
So I think there's scope for more work sharing. I think we need to focus on how we improve the pay and benefits of jobs. And frankly, with what we've seen with productivity growth over the last 5 years, I think we need to think long and hard about why it is that productivity growth has slowed down, why we're not seeing the benefits of the robots that everyone's so scared of. I think part of the answer to that question is that we've seen a slowdown in capital investment. Capital deepening in the U.S. is about half of the decline in productivity growth.
Why did that happen, do you think?
I think that's partly a result of the financial crisis. I think it's partly a result.
8 years.
It was a pretty bad financial crisis.
So you don't think government policies in any way are discouraging investment? When the FCC suddenly says it's going to regulate the internet as if it were a cable system, and then all of the big providers cut their capital spending, you don't think policy is hurting at all?
I think what's much more important is that businesses don't see the reason to expand their capacity because demand has been so weak, not only in the U.S. but also around the world.
Yeah, also hard when the government's breathing down your neck. Can we just go ahead.
Yeah, if I could just jump in, I think there is a feedback loop there. I mean, if you believe that technology is creating inequality, if you believe, as I do, that technology is one of the main reasons we see stagnant wages in the United States for decades now, and while you've seen this decoupling of productivity and wages, then clearly lower wages means less viable consumers, and that means less demand. So technology can, in a sense, be a bit self-limiting in terms of destroying demand and perhaps destroying that incentive to invest in further technology.
But don't forget the role of policy here too. The real value of the minimum wage in the U.S. today is below where it was in the 1960s. In the U.K., where the minimum wage is around equivalent of $10 an hour, they haven't had the rise in inequality that we've seen. They didn't have the detachment of productivity and pay. So I think policy plays a big role. And frankly, I think if we do have more wage pressures, that's going to give companies incentives to be more efficient with their workforce.
You mean wage pressures? That is, if we force companies to have to raise the minimum amount that they pay, if we do pass a law to force them to do that, that could get the companies to be more efficient. The thing is, everyone sells the minimum wage, raise the minimum wage. There's fewer than 2 million workers in the 150 million worker economy are on minimum wage, and the average time they're on minimum wage is less than a year. So how is it that if we raise the minimum wage, suddenly we're helping the entire economy? Instead,
let me answer that.
Inflation, and we'll have to raise everyone, because if I was making 13 an hour and you raise that high school kid to 13 an hour from 7, I'm thinking now I want 20.
Well, that's the answer to one of your questions about it's more than 2 million over affected, number one. Number two, if you raise the minimum wage back to where it was, $11 an hour, $12 an hour, you're helping tens of millions of people.
Where it was.
Where it was in the 1960s in real terms.
Oh, in real terms,
so what we've done is we've had a real wage cut at the bottom. But I'm not only talking about minimum wage causing stronger wage growth. If we have a high pressure labor market, if the unemployment rate continues to fall, it's fallen from 10 to 5%. In spite of all those regulations that you said that were strangling
yes,
companies.
and we saw the kind of jobs that are coming back. I mean, they're working in Walmart.
They look just like the jobs we had before. So if you think that the problem...
Actually, your chart, the gig economy jobs aren't just like the jobs we had before.
No, if you look at the occupations of the jobs, and also that chart goes back from before the recession. So I'm just talking about if you look at the nature of jobs the best we can since the end of the recession, they look a lot like the jobs that we had before.
But when we're in a freelance job, isn't our entire psychology changed? Aren't we not as willing to buy a home because my job is only freelance, it could end at any moment? I mean, the entire psyche for investing and for betting on the future changes, doesn't it, Kate?
Well, and we talk about, the two issues we're kind of touching on is the quality of the jobs and the consistency. Do I have a good enough job? Is it high enough paying? Is there a huge separation? That's number one. Number two, you're talking about the consistency from an employee point of view. And that's where, again, I think technology starts to play a role, like those, the 92% of the Uber drivers who are supplementing income. We're invested in a company called Applause that is crowdsourced in the wild testing. If you're Google and you're launching an app and you want to know that it works on all these different digital gizmos around the world on different networks in different conditions, you need to test it quickly in the wild. There used to be, it started out by being employees who used it to supplement their income in the Ukraine, in Indianapolis, not just in Silicon Valley, and you do it online at night, during the day, anytime you want. Now folks are doing this as a full-time job. So you can end up, and again, separate issue around benefits and worker status that Alan's done some work on, but there are more opportunities in certain ways for people to find that consistency,
Okay.
and I think the more we get that out there, the better off things will be. But I think how they get their benefits, I think, is a separate issue.
Okay. Here's one reason I think that all of us should be very worried about this future and the whole jobs question, and it's because of something I heard at Milken 1 year ago. So I'm in this little tiny room, I'm watching. Here's this kind of mad scientist type of guy who does this machine learning stuff, and he says this. Now, I made a speech. He's speaking in May. I made a speech previous November. It's about 6 months, right? And I was talking about how computers today are 10 to 15,000 times smarter than they were just 10 years before. But then he says, they're already better right now at identifying a cancer cell in a slide. Computers are better at seeing a photo and knowing what it's showing than humans. Humans get it wrong more than computers do. And then he goes to say, but I made that speech in November. Today, in May, computers are now 15 times smarter than they were just last November. And he said, now at some point, computers are going to be better than humans at everything except playing violin, except the most creative stuff. He said, now you might think that that's 50 years away. You might think it's 5 years away. But whatever date you want to put on it, remember this, 5 years after that date, the computers are 1,000 times smarter than that. So we're not getting all that much smarter, guys, and the machines are getting way smarter. So which jobs are next to get wiped out? You want to take that?
I'm going to challenge that premise. I mean, The Economist just had an article saying that Moore's Law is slowing down.
Yeah, right.
Well, I think that's
So-
riveting.
so
we're,
if it's-
we're moved by that. You got to elaborate a little. We got it.
Well,
Therefore,
the computers aren't getting faster at the same pace as they used to.
well, okay. But he's talking smarter. He wasn't just talking
Okay.
speed. He's talking smarter, and with that AI component, then never mind just gigahertz rates, right?
Well, let me go back to what I said earlier. You know, if we can replace more of what humans are doing, that frees us up to provide other types of services. And throughout human history, we've been pretty creative. I mean, look at the massive decline in manufacturing jobs and how that freed up people to go into the services and now to go into healthcare. So, and some of that can be improved by technology, but I don't think all of physical therapy is going to be replaced by technology. And there also are many jobs right now. Starbucks doesn't need to employ people to make you a cup of coffee. People value purchasing coffee from someone who's working at the Starbucks. So I think we're kind of forgetting the human nature of work and the value that people put on the services provided by people.
Martin, he just talked about how great it was that factory jobs declined and we freed people to do other new things. But I thought the decline of the manufacturing base in the U.S. is one of the biggest reasons for why the lowest end, the least educated workers who used to get paid $25 an hour to make a car are doing so poorly.
Yeah,
it wasn't so great that we freed them from the factory, was it?
Well, it wasn't great for them, and ultimately it is a distributional issue. I think the fact is that people that don't have that capability to do very high-level creative things are going to be left out of this process, and they've lost those well-paying factory jobs, and now they're working at Walmart or they're doing the gig economy, and those opportunities could well evaporate too in the future. We have seen that job creation since the Great Recession has been centered pretty heavily in these less desirable, lower wage service sector jobs, and that's, I think, a trend that will continue. And as we look at the nature of those jobs, working in fast food, flipping hamburgers, stocking the shelves in Walmart, a lot of those jobs are likely to disappear in the future too. So that we can't. There's no guarantee that even those less desirable jobs are going to be there.
But those manufacturing jobs weren't so great before they were unionized.
Yeah, exactly.
So don't gloss over the past. We can improve the service sector jobs, partly, as Dennis whispered in my ear, by raising the minimum wage, which he's just signed on to.
No, when they do that, they're going to hire robots instead to serve your Wendy's burger and cook your Wendy's burger. That's my point, is that you will eliminate those jobs by limiting.
We haven't seen that. You don't see that in the UK.
Well, the
but on
Congressional
top of
Budget
that,
Office said if you raise the minimum wage, you will lose 1 million jobs.
No, they said if you raise the minimum wage to $10, I think 20 million people would get a raise, and something like 0.5% of the workforce would have
But a sign
less
dollar
time
on that,
working.
we'll circle back around.
You can just Google it if you like.
Yes.
I do think it's inevitable. A lot of these jobs are going to disappear. It's hard for me to imagine that 50 years from now, there are going to be people working at the McDonald's flipping hamburgers.
But
Those
here's the
jobs-
thing.
People said that 50 years ago,
always-
too.
Again, is that what we need necessarily? I mean, how do we get them in a different place is one of my questions. And I do think, look at people move from, 70 to 80% of folks worked on farms since 1870, and it's less than 1% today. Those things are going to happen. So what can we do from a technical point of view, from a business point of view, from a policy point of view, to understand this and encompass this? I don't think we need to limit the past. I think we have to embrace the future and figure out how to plan for it.
Okay, so guys, I got to point out that I always have worried less about job disruption because I keep reading and hearing that it's the McDonald's job that will be hurt, and I'm way above a McDonald's French fry shoveler, so I'm okay. But this next machine learning revolution, the things that are happening is now it's our jobs that are also on the block. Let's think about this. Charles Schwab and Company runs a TV ad saying, hey, sign up for us now. You can get our automated software financial planner. Financial advisors, you're going to go on the way out. Lawyers, where you can just make a will on your own, let software help you. The New York Times had a story. This really, frankly, made me feel outraged that in 5 to 10 years, 80 or 90% of all news articles you read will be written entirely by software, not by some brilliant, insightful, provocative journalist. Now, you guys might consider that an improvement, but what happens to all those jobs? Aren't we now looking, guys, at far higher level jobs are in danger?
I think that's a risk. There's no question. But I also think it's going to lead to new sectors. As I said before, most of the jobs that we have, most of the job growth that we've seen over your lifetime have been in occupations that people didn't know existed when you were born. So I don't sell short human ingenuity when it comes to finding new uses for people to work. And I think if we have more income, people are going to demand more products and services, and that'll support the economy. And people will have more leisure if their hours go down, and that'll increase demand for leisure services.
Guys, should we move into solutions here? Proposals? And let's start with Martin, who basically wants to pay every single American like $75,000 a year for not working. I realize I mischaracterized that, but you go ahead and correct it.
You have, given a somewhat
What's the
higher
figure,
number.
Martin?
It's only 30,000.
I might start at 10 or 12,000.
10 or 12?
I do think that we need to provide at some point a guaranteed income. I think that it may be premature to think about that now, but eventually, as we move toward this future, there's going to be probably no alternative but to
Isn't that a
provide people with an
disincentive to
income.
work?
It is, but
There's
that's,
no work.
that's the reason to start out minimally. You want to give people an income floor. You don't want to be so generous that you destroy that incentive to work. And I think that there is evidence to suggest that if you give people a basic safety net, that they will actually perhaps be more willing to take risks. There's a well-known phenomenon known
See,
as
you hear that word give? If you give people, I always felt like I needed to earn it. I mean, maybe I'm just terribly antiquated, but does anyone else up here have a problem with just instantly paying $10,000 or $15,000 to people who don't work? Anyone on the panel? No, you guys love this idea?
I would say that
You
the
like-
idea of a basic minimum income should animate our policy. And we sort of have that when it comes to work already. When you take the minimum wage and the earned income tax credit, an exercise that policymakers often go through is, will a worker who works full-time be able to take a family of four out of poverty, which requires more than the $10,000 or $12,000 that Martin was discussing. And I think that already animates our policy. And I think if we do face a problem of employment, then that's certainly something to consider in the future. But even more importantly, before we get there, we have to make sure that all Americans have a basic set of opportunities. And right now, given the tremendous gap in wealth that we've seen develop over the last 30 years, the starting line is very, very far from equal. And that's not in the nation's interest. The inequality is reducing upward mobility.
Okay.
So when I think about policy, again, you have sort of the economic experts here. I think of it in a couple ways. One, I've talked a lot about education. I think getting digital literacy up is a given, and I think needs to be started very, very early. I think this separation of benefits and employment is really important. Obamacare is a first step in that. I think there are other things we can do so that those two things become dislocated. The third, I think, is really active public-private partnerships, which I think really work well. I'm involved in one in Northern California, The Last Mile. It's a coding academy in San Quentin. Typical recidivism, 60%. Programs out of this, 0. But more importantly, when you listen to the excitement of these individuals coming out of San Quentin, one of whom I spoke with, who asked to stay in a year longer to get his certification, because they can provide for their families and have a huge sense of pride about doing this. And this is something where we have 70 coders that stand in line to teach these folks. So I also think there's a real role for private enterprise to play alongside public solutions.
Michael?
I mean, first of all, I think we do replace most of the journalists with artificial intelligence. I mean, they're already...
Wasn't it artificial to begin with?
No, there
I
are
was
already
just kidding.
systems that will take an earnings call, the transcript from an earnings call in your 10Q and write a financial news report, take a box score and write a sports report. So it's happening already. No, seriously, I think there are a few things. First of all, I do think I'm shocked, but excited in a positive way, that even these, crazy tech people, Martin included, are starting to think about, if in fact we're starting to automate activities faster than we can create new jobs, as we always have for 150 years, but if in fact that's changing, what are some things that we can do? And so whether it's basic income or, a much expanded earned income tax credit, which might be more incenting work than just, helicopter money. But, I think it's exciting to think that, we're at least thinking about what might happen in those cases. And then I'd pile on to Kate's suggestion that we really need to figure out how to make benefits more portable. As even if it's not gig economy, it's just the increasing churn, the little bit, the atomization in terms of the relationship between employer and employee, making sure that you can carry health care, unemployment, et cetera, those types of benefits with you is incredibly important.
All right. Martin, about your paying people 10 or 15,000. Wait, don't we already do that with, I believe the average is $25,000 to $30,000 roughly for a poor household that can get state aid and can get Medicaid coverage and these different benefits. Aren't we already doing that? Are you saying in addition to that, you give them cash as well? Is that?
Well, I don't think it's the case that poor households get $25,000 under any circumstances. I mean, back in the Clinton world, we pretty much wiped out traditional health care. There are time limits on how long people can get cash benefits. So we don't have really a great safety net in this country. We've got food stamps, which is really the only program that, for example, a single unemployed male can get something. And you've got people living in West Virginia, states like this, they get their food stamps. What they do with it, they take that and they buy cases of soda, and then they sell that 50 cents on the dollar,
freedom.
and they generate a little bit of cash,
Entrepreneurialism.
a tiny amount, and that's what they survive on. So to say that we already have this fantastic safety net in the United States where people are getting, $30,000 or something is, I think, pretty far off base.
Okay, let's not get mean.
So,
but okay.
yeah, I do think that we need to move to a future where we begin to look at taking care of everyone and not just certain groups of people that are eligible for certain programs and so forth.
All right. I'm going to go to our former chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors on this one. Alan, is government going to be the answer to this big problem? I'm hoping that this problem has to be solved by the private side, but do you think that that government leads the way here, or does the private side lead the way?
Well, I think the private side has contributed to a lot of the problems that we have. And I think we have to get away.
Sorry, how?
Well, we did have this financial crisis, number one.
Oh, and that wasn't at all because of the federal government policy saying let's give home loans to the worst credit risks anywhere. Had nothing to do with that. This was all just the private business world's fault. Okay, continue. Come on, man. You can't ignore that, can you?
That was not the major cause of the crisis. There's a lot of blame to go around. Let's not refight that. I think the point I want to make is that we need to think about government and private sector solutions. And what's worked well in this country was government and private sector working really well. The whole revolution in fracking is a good example. It was government research together with private entrepreneurship and private capital working rather well. And I think that the government does have a role to play. And I frankly think if the government doesn't play a role, we're headed to some very serious difficulties because it's very hard to see how you generate support in this country for things like immigration reform or free trade agreements if you have the country so polarized. So I think that the direction that the private sector has gone over the last 30 years has affected our political environment today. And there are some obvious solutions for government and private sector to work on together. We could have a grand bargain, for example, where it comes to workers in this emerging gig economy. Right now, they're treated as independent contractors and they're on their own. Labor unions have argued that they're employees, but when court cases come, and there was a big plaintiffs' settlement in California and Massachusetts, which left the drivers as independent contractors, and the plaintiffs' attorneys made out much better than the workers, as best I can tell. So I think we can create a new category of employment where Uber drivers, workers on TaskRabbit, and these other very rapidly growing online platforms can get many of the protections and benefits that employees get, but not the ones that don't make sense. Not overtime protection, because the workers can choose their own hours. Nobody's forcing them to work over 40 hours a week. But civil rights protection. Independent contractors can be discriminated against.
Yet Alan, 200,000 people have chosen to become Uber drivers, even though it pays no benefits, has no job protections, et cetera. If they, of their own free will, are willing to do that, why do we have to rush to then pass new rules to force Uber to pay them the stuff that they're not insisting that they get paid? Why don't we let them decide whether they're going to work for a place that does or doesn't pay those extra benefits?
That would be an argument for child labor, that these kids back in the day
Yeah.
really
Yeah.
chose to go and work.
Child
in
labor. Wait, you're saying that these Uber drivers have been forced to become Uber drivers and working for no benefits? They chose to do those jobs, didn't they?
They actually pay higher than taxi jobs.
Out of
driving.
the
They pay
choices
about
that
the
they
same
have.
if you
Have to,
take out
'cause no
expenses.
benefits.
The taxi drivers don't get benefits either.
I was just going to say,
but
and get no flexibility.
I think our system of protections for employees has actually helped our country to be prosperous, helped the middle class to grow, and I think it might make sense to let the drivers form associations and negotiate so that they could decide
Well, they could.
jointly.
No one's stopping them, right? They
Right
could
now,
do that right
the
now.
Sherman Antitrust Act prevents them from doing that.
Individual drivers aren't allowed to organize?
Independent contractors cannot band together to set their price.
Someone's got to change that, don't they?
Well,
So that's
I
one
mean,
example. So that's one part of this new social compact that I'd recommend providing. But I'd go further. Take health insurance. Right now, the intermediaries could free ride because if somebody's an Uber driver and their partner has health insurance and they're covered by their partner's health insurance, their partner's company is subsidizing Uber. Uber ought to contribute, I think, to the healthcare exchanges where many of their drivers are going to end up getting health insurance.
Okay.
So we could end up with we could have a more uniform system which protects workers in this emerging sector and leads to higher quality jobs.
Okay. Kate, it sounds like Alan's feeling like the government really has to lead the way. But I'm thinking of the search to map the genome of the human species. And the government was funding research on it for 20 to 25 years. They're toiling away. And then along comes this private guy, Craig Venter, and Celera, and they do it in 2 years. Isn't private enterprise going to have to lead the way to solve this?
Well, I mean, they're the ones that have the jobs, and I think you want to keep them as unfettered as possible with the kinds of guidance and protection. That's, I think, the best role for regulation is around the edges, not in the center. So I think private enterprise has to help, and I think our system works. I mean, we're talking a lot about Uber drivers in San Francisco. One of the things that's happening, even before collective bargaining, is they're not being treated as well at Uber as they are at Lyft. Guess what? Everybody's going over to Lyft. And you see this, the best drivers are there. So if you're standing on the corner and thinking, well, I think I'm going to try Lyft. I mean, things have a way of finding their right place over time. And if folks are not being treated well, you see where supply and demand goes of quality. And now, particularly, again, in an environment with Lyft, where we're having a lot of direct communication, we rate each other, we have a real-time understanding of where the highest quality is. I think that's a good example where capitalism and private enterprise is doing the right thing, even for the worker in this case. They're going to the best jobs.
Michael, we've heard other proposed solutions from the other panelists. Give us a couple of breakthrough ideas.
No, I like Alan's idea of just we should all just work a lot less. No, but no, it's serious, right? I mean, between the
And get
Industrial
paid more.
Revolution and mid last century, right? I mean, I saw a huge reduction in the work week. But I think from our research, I think another thing that's interesting. Again, I think Alan's research on this is terrific. That we've never been able to predict where the new jobs come from. But if you look at all of the activities that we pay people to do, something like less than 5% of those jobs, of those activities, require a median level of human ability to sense human emotion and reason about human emotion. Again, to do the other activities well, you might need to, but just in terms of what's required. And so what that suggests is if we are able to create new things for people to do, whether we pay them for it in traditional job employment sense, or maybe just as something people do even if they're getting basic income, maybe we can find more things for people to do that involve creativity. Again, single-digit percentage of activities we pay people to do require a median level of human creativity or a median level of ability to sense and reason about human emotion. Some of these things that we consider to be fundamentally human, we don't actually value in terms of paying people to do in the economy. So let's maybe think about things that people can do. As Tim O'Reilly says, let's not just think about what we pay people to do, but what needs doing, and maybe there are more things that need doing that can involve creativity, that can involve human emotion, and some of these other things that are valuable to us.
Martin, I heard one expert say that as computers and machine learning get smarter and they start to do everything, that you're never going to be impressed to watch a robot sit there and perform on the violin. The reason we are impressed is because we're watching that real human being play amazing things on the violin, and gee, I could never do that. But to see a machine do it perfectly, not so impressive. So you're not going to go to a concert where robots are playing orchestral music. So what about the idea of what kind of jobs end up not getting wiped out by all this stuff? Is it how creative are they, and how much potential is there for trying to grow those ranks?
Well, I mean, maybe violin players are safe, but how many people make a living doing that? It's already, it's already very hard as any kind of artist to survive in the economy. So I don't think that everyone becoming an artist is a solution unless we give everyone a basic income and then they choose to be an artist because that's what they find fulfilling. That's very possible. It's also possible to combine these solutions, give everyone a minimal income and have a work sharing program so that people work on top of that, but they work less. I mean, there are a number of ways to approach that. But in general, we have to understand that there's a powerful market force at work here. I mean, it is the drive to profitability under capitalism that's going to eliminate a lot of opportunities. Another point would be that I'm quite skeptical of this idea that the gig economy is the future and that's where we should pin our hopes. We have this one shiny example, which is Uber. Okay, and when people talk about the gig economy, they always talk about Uber. Uber is pretty unique in the sense that there are a couple of things there that protect workers doing Uber. One is that you are anchored locally. You can only drive in your neighborhood. You don't have to compete against everyone in the world. Another thing is that there's an entry barrier. You've got to own a car that's, I think, not more than 5 years old. That is what results in higher wages for Uber drivers, okay? Many of the other examples we see in the gig economy are information-based jobs. You're going to be competing with people from Bangladesh, okay? Those wages are going to be driven down to very, very low wages. So I'm just not sure either that those jobs are going to persist forever because I think automation is coming, or that they're really a good solution anyway. So.
Okay. Alan, lately our government has been working really hard to pass new rules to make it all but impossible for a U.S. company to move its headquarters to a lower tax district in another country, and we're trying to kind of block them and stop it, and never mind that, gee, maybe we could just make tax policy here nicer to so they want to stay. But in the same way with this tech threat, should government impose some type of limits to where, you're not allowed to wipe out that many jobs, you're not allowed to use technology that's going to make it so that we don't need insurance adjusters anymore. I mean, should government be imposing limits? Do you think anyone inside government will try to impose limits like that?
I don't think so. And I don't think it should. I think what government needs to do is to make sure that we can help people make a transition so that if insurance agents get displaced, and that means that insurance products are now cheaper and other people are benefiting, that there are other opportunities available for people. And government has lots of things to do. We didn't talk about investing in infrastructure, which we're greatly underinvesting in the U.S., and that's going to hold back our productivity in the future. I think, frankly, given where we are in productivity growth, the government should invest more in fundamental research. And if I remember correctly, the internet wasn't invented by the private sector, it was government research.
DARPA.
Well, the NIH is the source of a lot.
NIH, and I think your
Including
history of
solar.
the mapping of the genome is, I think Eric Lander would disagree with some aspects of it. So I think government has played a fundamental role in producing these breakthroughs together with the private sector. And
They didn't disagree with the solar stuff more recently, though. That's been a little bit of a setback.
the solar stuff, and Tom Khalil is here, can talk more about it. The Recovery Act actually was a big boost into supporting solar power, which is now, I learned from Al Gore yesterday, who did play a role in inventing the internet.
He did. Yeah.
It's now cheaper than natural gas for generating electricity.
Okay, we'll make another bet on that. Kate, you want to take it?
Yeah, well, again, looking at what happens in the private sector, a couple things that we kind of downplay are, and Alan, you touched on this whole issue of the experience economy. People do want to interact with other people. And it is the skills, Michael, that you refer to that can't be replicated. We don't want to have replicated. Let's think of it as something we can all relate to that would be very difficult. Certainly, we can paint a situation where AI can decide exactly what kind of illness I have and how it should be treated. If I'm sitting there deciding whether or not I want to have surgery or radiation or chemo for my cancer, that is a high degree of being terminal, I probably want to talk to somebody about that. I may have family circumstances, I may have quality of life issues, how I want to spend what is going to likely be my last days may be very different than Alan's. I don't want that to be coming out of a computer. I think there's going to be demand for those kinds of things. It goes beyond even, I think, physical therapists, people who take a lot of that data and make sense of it for us. I think that also happens when you talk about collaboration in companies. You get a lot of data that comes, we all talk about big data, we're big investors in it as venture capitalists. All that massive amount of data don't mean a lot lot until you actually can make sense out of it, understand really where the critical aspects of it are, particularly as this is adapting and changing. You want to bring two different disparate threads together to collaborate and come up with a new solution. Those are not as easily done by machines today. So I think there's a huge amount of opportunity, I think, for private sector to play a role, and where I think humans have a unique opportunity to harness technology to do well. I don't think it's all doom and gloom.
You know, now we can open up to questions unless our panelists refuse to answer them because they are just simply too awesome. But let's go ahead and start there and then there. Go ahead.
Hi, Katie Thangavelu with the Milken Institute. I just wanted to say Singapore has been providing healthcare, education, and housing to everybody. So this is not something we can't do. And in the context, I just read a book called $2 a Day about post-welfare America, about how many people simply have no cash at all. So they're bartering food stamps, you know, or doing what you're saying, being entrepreneurial to try to make some money. So the situation is actually, I think, quite dire. I want to just ask the panel, you're probably aware that there is a workforce crisis coming. Boston Consulting Group says by 2030, you know, we're just not going to find the right workers. So these are some real issues. And actually, what I'd like to ask you, sir, is how do we publicize the need for literacy on all of these issues? You know, career literacy, economic literacy, in addition to
literacy, the
digital
whole bit.
literacy.
I agree.
How do we just begin broadcasting? That, you know, we
See,
got to get upskilled.
Okay, so and then pass the mic to the gentleman back there for next. But my thought is, it's just not enough to do educational campaigns and say it's the right thing to do. I think you have to give financial incentive. I think we ought to be granting companies that agree to open up in the worst neighborhoods in the inner city, that would let them operate, as Art Laffer says, 10 years tax-free. Let employees who work there and live in that neighborhood earn salaries 10 years tax-free. I think we ought to give companies triple tax credit if they train a new employee who's taken off the welfare rolls, a double tax credit to train an employee in the worst neighborhoods where they've set up these new factories. I think there's financial incentives and business incentives can be done rather than just this is really important.
We
So
do
go
all
ahead.
we do all that. We have enterprise zones. We have targeted jobs tax
We
credit.
have not done the Art Laffer plan. I mean, nothing's happened on that.
Well,
In terms
maybe it
of
wasn't
letting
such a good
company set up
plan,
and
but
operate
we
10
do
years
it.
tax-free. Well, the enterprise zones have been a failure, but anyway, so go ahead. Otherwise, where we are
I will
economically.
say a quick response. I think I
Art
think
Laffer
things
was
like
wrong.
this, I'm sorry, Tom, are really helpful. I do think in some ways the concerns that Martin raises are, in many ways are helpful in this dialogue, getting people really motivated. I mean, these all the things that you talked about are available for free online for people to learn. Do they know it's there? Do they know it's available? And people can learn this on mobile phones, which are now available in all emerging countries. So I think it really is an opportunity for us to continue that conversation. I think we need to, you know, keep it going.
Could I
Okay.
jump in real quick?
Yeah?
Yeah.
Sorry, Tom. Just on the demographic question, right? I mean, in Japan already the workforce is decreasing in size. If you look over the past 50 years, call the annual GDP, and Alan, you should correct me if I'm wrong, annual economic growth is roughly 3.5%. Half of it because of productivity growth, which we've got to figure out, but half of it because of increases in workforce. Because we're all aging, we're going to lose half of the historical source of economic growth, which is really scary because we're really starting from behind by about half. And that means our kids aren't going to have better lives than we will. So it's a
See,
tremendous
I was
challenge.
hoping to end up
Well,
on
actually,
Kate's
the
hopefulness,
average-
and now you're a
Well, but
buzzkill,
again,
Michael.
is it
Tom
a
will fix
problem
it.
or an opportunity? Actually,
Yeah.
Michael, the average, you know, that advanced skilled manufacturer, the average age is 56 years old. So again, more opportunity for jobs.
We're
Tom.
running out of time. Just two more questions. He's been patient. So you got the mic still? Or
Yes, I've got the
Go
mic.
for it.
So one idea is, given that we have this uncertainty about the future, and we could wind up with a more optimistic scenario in which a bunch of jobs created, or Martin might be right. I'm wondering what the panelists think about the notion of scenario planning. That is, think about a bunch of different credible scenarios and say, all right, if Martin's scenario comes true, what would we do?
Yeah.
If we've got anyway.
And be
just
creative
interested
about
in
that.
people's
Every
thoughts on
business
that.
should
I
be
think
doing
that's
that.
great.
Guys, I'm sorry, but they've wrapped us. I apologize to the other question I didn't get in there. I owe you a favor. Great job by the panel, guys. Good job. Thank you very much.